Thomas Piketty, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for your invitation.
So I'm really interested in the evolution of your thinking over the course of the last decade, from Capital in the 21st Century to the new book on the history of inequality, or perhaps the history of equality. Let's start at the beginning. What is the core of the argument of Capital in the 21st Century, and what is the meaning of that famous slogan, R is bigger than G?
You're bringing me back 10 years before, but let me say, generally speaking, that I've been working in the history of the distribution of income and wealth for 20 years now, and I'm trying to make progress in this direction. My new book, my brief history of equality, I think is not only briefer than the first two books, but I think it's probably also clearer about the big message, which is this long-run movement toward equality, starting at the end of the 18th century with the French Revolution, the US Revolution, and this movement continuing throughout the 19th century, 20th century, and until today. And so in this very broad perspective, R bigger than G, is still important. It's always been important. And one way to realize what it means and the role it plays is, if you look at the evolution of top wealth holders, in recent decades, or even during the pandemic, if you look at global billionaires, 10 years ago, the richest billionaire on the planet used to own 30 or 40 or 50 billion dollars, and today, they have 200 or more. So if you look at the evolution, the rate at which top wealth holders increase their wealth, is of the order of 7-8% per year. Very, very high rate of return to this very high wealth level, which is obviously a lot bigger than the growth rate of world GDP. So, the growth rate of world GDP could be, 2 or 3% per year. That's partly due to population growth. So actually, if you look at average income or average wealth, it will be, 1 or 2% per year. So R bigger than G, first means it that you have a rate of return on wealth, and especially on very high wealth portfolio, which tend to be bigger than the growth rate. Now, that doesn't mean that the rate of return for small saving is bigger than the growth rate. I mean, as you know, the interest rate right now is 0%, or actually is negative if you look at the real interest rate and take away inflation. So people who have little saving, for them, R is certainly not bigger than G. But for very high wealth portfolio, so to take another example than top billionaire, in my book, Capital in the 21st Century, I collected data on large university endowments, which is interesting because, say in the US, you have 800 universities with capital endowments, and you have pretty good data about what they do with their endowment and the rate of return they get, which is not the case, for billionaire, the kind of information we have in Forbes magazine, etc., is not so high quality. And so at least, this university capital endowments, we have really good data. And so what you see, and what I have shown in Capital in the 21st Century, is that if you take a long period of time, say 1980 to 2010, which is what I was looking at when I published Capital in the 21st Century back in 2013, it's very spectacular. The very highest capital endowments, they will get a net return, net of inflation, net of all administrative expenses, operating expenses of 7, 8, 9% per year. If you look at the middle endowments, they will get 5, 6. If you look at the very small endowment, they will get 2, 3. And it's very spectacular because you could say, okay, if these universities are doing useful things with the money, that's okay. Well, maybe this creates huge inequality among US universities and bottom half of US universities, bottom 2/3 of US universities, don't have as much resources as I think they should have. And sometimes very top places, have more money than what they are able to spend in a useful manner. But in any case, if you apply this kind of mechanism to private individuals and to the distribution of wealth in general, you can see how this mechanism can contribute to unsustainable level of wealth concentration. And it's more than just to finish on this, it's more than just a question of money. The ownership is first and foremost about power. So the distribution of wealth is about the distribution of power, to make decisions about your life, to invest, to create a firm, to protect your family. And so, I'm not asking for complete equality, but, if you have such a huge concentration of wealth at the top and the middle class is diminishing in their wealth share, and the bottom 50%, they basically never own anything and don't have much security or much economic opportunity to invest, create. I think it's not only unfair, but pretty inefficient for society in general. Now, the good news is that there are many ways around this, through policies and through various institutions, including, of course, fiscal policies, transformation of the legal system, giving more power to workers, reinventing the very notion of property and property relations so that different people can participate to decision making. And again, this is this long-run movement of a transformation in the fiscal and legal system that we see in the long run. So it's not only a dream, this is what we've seen over the past 2 centuries. And this is this optimistic perspective on the history of equality, which I really want to communicate, because I realized, just to finish on this, I realized after writing Capital in the 21st Century that the R bigger than G story, it's very important. It's still very important today, as much as 10 years ago. But there's a risk that people only remember this and have a sort of very deterministic and sort of pessimistic view of the future, which has never been my way of looking at the world. But maybe I was not sufficiently clear about this, and I'm now I'm making progress by discussing, like with you, for instance, today, and I think maybe I am now clearer on this.
So I feel a lot of empathy for your position, because I became less known when you, through my work on the threat that authoritarian populism poses to democracy. And I feel that people have overshot the pessimism and into a form of fatalism. And my latest book is relatively optimistic relative to the current consensus. And I feel your pain and the difficulty of communicating this. So I want to make sure that we get to the optimism in a moment. Before that, though, I want you to help me, as a non-economist, think through the main sort of criticism of capital in the 21st century. So I'm going to do a layman's best attempt at summarizing that criticism, which is that when you look, for example, at the richest people in the world today, they are not people who are inheritors who have invested their money. They are actually people who come from upper middle class families usually, and have made their fortunes through entrepreneurial activities. So people like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Larry Page, Sergey Brin, Larry Ellison. That is a list of the richest people in the world right now I've been reading off. And in fact, supposedly this shows that in the last 50 or so years, R has not been bigger than G. And in a related line of criticism, the concentration of wealth doesn't come from the very richest people. It doesn't come from the billionaires that we love to hate, but it actually comes from private property, especially in residential property, held among the upper middle class. So that actually, to the extent to which wealth has outpaced the increase in incomes, it is because of, frankly, the kinds of lawyers and doctors and academics who probably listen to this podcast who have, nice apartments in New York City and San Francisco and Paris.
Yeah.
And that's really at the heart of this development. So again, I'm sort of
Okay.
trivializing the main line of objection as I understand it. Help me think through why you think that those criticisms are wrong.
Okay, let me start with the mobility argument, and then I will get to the role of real estate. And, both issues are really important and interesting, although I disagree very much with both statements. But let me start with mobility. Of course, there's always mobility, and you always have people at the top, who come from nowhere. I mean, you could also mention, Russian oligarchs. Their parents were not rich. There was no private property in the Soviet Union, so by definition, these are self-made men. Now, being
not the most appealing example of economic mobility, but a real example of economic mobility.
Yeah, but so what I mean by this is that being a self-made man in itself doesn't mean that everything is fine, so it's important,
sure,
and so that's point number one, and that's important because, in the way you make money, we like in the West, of course, to explain that, the Western billionaires and Californian billionaires or European billionaires have nothing to do with Russian oligarchs. But, if you look at the dynamics of wealth, it's always about, making good deals, buying firms at a time when their price is low, selling them when they are very high, making huge capital gains. Even if you don't yourself make always a big invention, let me make very clear, Bill Gates did not invent the computer, Elon Musk did not invent Twitter, or did not invent the electric car engine. You have thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of engineers, researchers, who have made this invention, who have contributed to this invention. Wealth creation is always a very collective process. We've been accumulating knowledge since the beginning of mankind, and you have, hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of researchers who are involved in these discoveries and who don't put their name and their paycheck at the bottom of their academic article all the time. And so, private property is a social construction that we invent as societies, and which is actually a useful invention, to the extent that we actually put limits on how much wealth concentration you have. But let me start by saying, all wealth creation in history, is collective in nature, and we should stop, thinking about, individual genius who have created everything. I think this kind of monarchical view of the economy, is completely outdated and has nothing to do with the reality in which we live today, where you have.
But to be clear, right, the nature of the objection, as I understand it, is not that Elon Musk deserves all of his money. It's just that it seems to be a counterexample to the idea that the driving force in our economy for the last decades has been returns on capital. Because whether or not Elon Musk deserves as much money as he has, I agree with you that we should have a social setup, which means that he has less money than he does today.
Sorry, Yascha, but it depends. It depends really what you mean by returns on capital. Making a huge capital gains, it's a form of return on capital. So you have this enormous returns on capital, which are very concentrated for a small group of capital owners. Whether it's a Russian oligarch who bought shares in Russian sector at a very low price, and then the price increased a lot, or whether it's Zuckerberg with Facebook, buying the share of one of his associates at a very low price, and then the price skyrocketing. If you look at all wealth, big fortune, it's always like that. And point number two, it's always been like that. So, if you look at, say, when I look at the Belle Epoque, I like to compare, wealth concentration today with wealth concentration at the end of the 19th century and before World War I. The idea is that innovation is only a characteristic, innovation and mobility is only a characteristic of today and was not the case in the past, is completely crazy. 1900, 1910 is the time where we invent, the automobiles, the electricity, the transatlantic. This is at least as important as Facebook or Twitter today. But this mobility and this innovation cannot justify any level of wealth concentration. And when you look back at this period, and you compare with the following period, my conclusion is that the level of wealth concentration that we had then, even though it was largely self-made and largely based on mobility, etc., was very much excessive in many different sense. You know, first, it contributed a lot to the political instability of Western societies, and I think it did contribute in the end, you know, to the rise of World War I, World War II, and everything we've seen after that. And also, from a purely economic perspective, it was not necessary in the sense that this extreme level of wealth concentration was drastically reduced through war, destruction, but also through progressive taxation, change in institution. And in the end, you know, the much lower level of wealth concentration that we've had after World War II, you know, was actually, you know, increased mobility, because you had some people, you know, from the middle class moving up, and you know, you had less extreme concentration of power. So to summarize, you know, R bigger than G, you know, is interesting, you know, it's important. You know, I've given you the example of returns to university endowments, and, you know, you can see that this has little to do with, you know, huge invention or whatever. So you have also size effect in the portfolio management, and these effects are also taken into account. You have also what you said, you know, a lot of mobility due to single individuals making huge capital gains on their specific investment for all sorts of good and bad reasons. You know, it's always difficult to decompose, you know, what's due to luck, what's due to just making a good deal against someone else, what's due to a you know, useful contribution. And, you know, we are not going to be able on an individual basis, you know, to make the difference. But if we look from a collective perspective at the level of wealth concentration, this is what matters. Now, going back to real estate and, you know, the middle class, you said something which is interesting, which is to say, okay, the increase in wealth inequality is not due to this top billionaire at the top, but rather to sort of upper middle class people who own real estate. Now, you know, that's not quite right. In the well, you know, at some level, you're certainly right that we cannot just look at billionaires. You know, we need to look at millionaires and multimillionaires. And, you know, I stress a lot the fact that if we want real redistribution of wealth, you know, you need to target people who are above 1 million or 5 million. And, you know, there are lots of people who have 10, 20, 50 millions. And in the end, there's a lot of money over there. And you cannot just look only at billionaires. And, you know, I fully agree on this. I've made a lot of research exactly on this. Regarding real estate, however, you are wrong, in the sense that if you look at the share of real estate at different levels of the wealth distribution, the basic fact is that, okay, at the very bottom, you know, people don't have real estate, they just have very small bank accounts. In the middle of distribution, real estate is very important. Now, as you move in the top 10% of the distribution, and even more so in the top 1% or top 0.1%, you know, the share of real estate goes down to you know, less, you know, to 0%. So in fact, if you look overall, you know, the orders of magnitude that are important to have in mind when we look at the wealth distribution are the following. The bottom 50% always owns, you know, close to zero, always less than 5% of total wealth. So in the US, it's going to be 2%. In Europe, it's going to be 4%. In Latin America, 1%. But, you know, in the end, it's close to zero everywhere. So what matters in the end is what you have in the top 10%, and what you have in the 40% who are in between the bottom 50 and the top 10, which I call the patrimonial middle class. Now, when real estate prices goes up, in fact, that's going to be good in relative terms for this middle 40% relative to the top 10, because the top 10% have much less real estate as a percentage of their total wealth than this middle 40%. So in fact, the huge increase in real estate prices in the past decades has actually contributed to a reduction of the top 10% wealth share to the benefit of this middle 40%. I mean, this doesn't mean that big, increase in real estate prices is a good news in itself, because of course, for those who are really poor, the bottom 50%. This makes it even more difficult to enter the game and become an owner. And it's,
just to help me understand, right? Because the way that I understand this criticism, and I'm not an economist, is precisely to say that the story as you told it in Capital in the 21st Century, or at least as it was interpreted, was this is all about wealth concentration at the very top and capital returns of people, say, like Elon Musk and a broader class of the top 1%. But according to this counter argument, what actually happened over the last decades is that the sort of 50th to 90th percentile, and perhaps especially the 80th, 85th, 90th, perhaps 95th percentile, has had very rapid returns on its wealth because of its investment in apartments in New York City, in apartments
and
in
in
Paris,
spite of
and
that,
so on and
and
so forth.
in
So
spite
that
of
actually
that,
the problem
Yascha, let me explain you. In spite of that, their wealth share has declined. This is the point. So, if you had only the real estate price effect, the wealth share of this middle 40%, the people between the 50th percentile and the 90th percentile, or even 95th percentile, their relative wealth share should have increased. But in fact, it has declined. And so, in effect, the increase in the real estate price has mitigated the increase in top wealth concentration. And the fact that top wealth concentration, in spite of this mitigating effect of rising real estate price, increased as much as it did, shows that the key effect driving increasing wealth concentration have nothing to do with real estate. It has to do much more with financial portfolio getting much higher return. So, it's not only billionaires. In general, if you look at stock market return in the long run, it's 7-8% per year, much bigger than the average rate of return for average wealth holders. And at the very top of the distribution, it's a mixture of the kind of university endowment effect, which I described earlier, which again is an interesting example to look at. The data is really striking because what this shows is that you have size effect in portfolio management. When you have 1 billion rather than 10 million, you can invest in various, financial derivatives, private equity, commodity derivatives. There's a set of sophisticated financial assets which are not accessible, even if you own 1 million. And if you have 100,000 or 10,000, you can ask your brother-in-law what to do with the money, but probably that's not going to get you very far. So, there's a set of financial assets which are accessible for very high wealth portfolio. And so this effect, okay, it doesn't make, the cover page of news magazine, like Bezos or Zuckerberg, but that's very important. At the same time, you also have these enormous capital gains related to very top billionaires, which is a separate phenomenon. You're right on this. But in any case, the real estate part of the story is not what's going to explain the increase in the top 10% wealth share, and certainly not the top 5% or top 1% wealth share.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was an interesting answer because I never quite knew what to make of that objection. I promised that we would talk about the positive message. So you write in the introduction to your new book, at least since the end of the 18th century, there has been a historical movement toward equality. The world of the early 2020s, no matter how unjust it may seem, is more egalitarian than that of 1950 or that of 1900, which were themselves in many respects more egalitarian than those of 1850 or 1780. Just at a descriptive level, talk to us about that progress. Why is it that in 2022, just looking at the state of equality in the world, we should at first glance be heartened relative to our own past?
Yeah, so what I'm trying to do, in this new book, A Brief History of Equality, is really to try to, to escape from the sort of current pessimism when you are really looking at the very recent evolution, and try to take this broad, historical comparative perspective. And if you do that, indeed, the broad evolution is a long-run movement toward more equality, which is not something that happened naturally. It happens through huge political mobilization, social struggles, and most importantly through constructive transformation of the legal system, the institutional system, the electoral system, the tax, educational, etc. So, to summarize, the movement, it's not a movement that has been there since Neolithic times. It's grounded in history. In particular, it starts at the end of the 18th century with, there are two sort of set of events which we start the process. I stress in particular, the abolition of the privileges of the aristocracy during the French Revolution, which is sort of the beginning of the end of societies based on privileges on the one hand, and the slave revolt in Saint-Domingue, which takes place in 1791, which is partly due to the French Revolution, but it's largely due to the slaves themselves, because people in Paris didn't want to put an end to slavery initially. So it's really a slave revolt which sets the beginning of the end of slave and colonial societies on the other hand. Now you can see that these two movements, of course, are still not over, in the sense that we still live today, in societies where the privileges of money in politics in particular are very important. I think the system of political, finance, the financing of the media, gives a lot more influence, to people with a lot of money than to normal citizens. And, maybe one day, when we look at what we call democracy today, we will come to realize that, okay, maybe it's better than in the 19th century where only the wealthiest people could vote, but it has nothing to do with a real democracy where you could expect a very strict limitation of the role of private money in politics, in media, in think tank, and much more egalitarian rights to participate to the political process. And if you look at the end of slavery and colonial society, okay, we've had the abolition of slavery, we've had decolonization, the end of apartheid, the end of segregation, but we still have enormous discrimination and racial inequality today, both at the domestic level, at the international level. So these two evolution, which have been continuing during the 19th century, the 20th century, with decolonization, the rise of progressive taxation, the rise of social security, the labor movement, and which has bring more equal societies today, radically more equal and radically different than what we had 1 century or 2 centuries ago. The general conclusion is certainly not that we should be happy and satisfied with this. My general perspective is that, we should and could continue this movement toward more equality, which requires, to think big, because the transformations that we've seen in the past are big. The legal system today, what defines workers' rights, tenants' rights, the tax system, the social security system, the education system, has nothing to do with the capitalist system of 1910. We talk about capitalism, but in fact, the system today is completely different from the system of 1 century ago. And so when I talk about the future, and I describe a system of participatory socialism, democratic federalism, many people will say, oh, that's so different from what we have today. Yeah, it's different from what we have today, but I would say, it's not more different from what we have today than what we have today is different from 1950 or 1910, which was very patriarchal, colonial capitalism. So we have to put the questions that we're trying to solve today into this broad historical perspective, if we want to solve the challenges of today. Because if we don't do that, and we always say, oh, we cannot change anything to the economic system, we cannot change anything to the tax system, then I think we are contributing, not only to the pessimism, but also to this rise of, xenophobic populism, to this rise of identity-based politics. Because, if you tell people, okay, there's nothing you can change about inequalities, there's nothing you can change about the economic system, governments cannot do anything except controlling their frontiers and their borders, then of course, 20 years or 30 years later, the entire political discussion is about border control and identity. But, this is just because you restrict the set of what we can talk about and what we can change in a certain manner, which in effect produces all these specificism. So what I'm trying to do, is to take stock of this enormous and very successful rise of equality in the past 2 centuries, which has been absolutely central in the rise of modern economic growth, modern economic prosperity, which has really relied on this huge increase in, economic rights, education for all, health for all. This has been central in the rise of modern economic growth, modern economic prosperity, and we should continue in this direction.
So I'm very sympathetic to that account, and again, it strikes me that my latest book is about greater social, the challenge of building ethnically and religiously diverse democracies, and I make a cautiously optimistic argument rooted in an understanding of how unjust societies were in the past, which I think allows us to see real progress over the last decades. But I know exactly what the response to that tends to be, which is say, what are you talking about? When I look at reality today, it's so unjust, it is so unequal. How can you say that there have been progress? So just to push you a little bit towards a description of the assumption of the last answer, which is what you say to people who say, well, hang on a second, you told us about how the benefits are going to the very, very richest and the biggest billionaires and so on. And the Gini coefficient in many Western countries is growing, and you have all of these policies which are exacerbating inequality. How can you say that there has been a growth in inequality? Now you have a really clearly evidenced answer to that. And it struck me that actually, when you look at the graphs in the first half of your book, you sometimes have the feeling of reading, something like Steven Pinker's Better Angels of Our Nature, which is not a thinker you would normally be associated with, but it goes through, the growth in life expectancy and the literacy rate, the fall in the share of income and the share of wealth held by the 1%. So just tell us that story. How is it that the economy looks different today than it did 100 years ago, and how is it that it's actually more equal than it was 100 years ago?
Yeah, so let's put some numbers about inequality and the concentration of wealth and concentration of income, because that's necessary to be able to make comparison across societies, comparison across long period of time, and this has been, after all, my main work has been to try to collect this historical information, and I'm very much working in the continuation of the Annales School of Social and Economic Histories that developed in France, but also the Anglo-American tradition of Kuznets and Atkinson, and building national accounts and distribution of income and wealth, so that we can make proper comparison. So if we look at the distribution of wealth today and compare it to 1 century ago, or the 19th century, there are 2 things which are true at the same time. The first thing is that there's been a decline in inequality, and I'm going to give you a number in a second. But the second thing is that inequality today is still enormous and has even increased in recent decades, even though we are not back to the 19th century level. And the 2 claims are true at the same time, and that maybe that's what's difficult for people to realize. So the reality, is a complex reality in the sense that there's been some progress toward more equality, but we still live in very unequal societies. So let's put numbers. If we look at the bottom 50% of the population, they still today, they almost don't own anything. They would own 4% of everything there is to own. So here I'm talking about real estate, companies, financial assets, net of debt. So I look at everything people own net of what they owe, and I look at the distribution of this. The bottom 50% of the population, if we lived in a completely equal society, they should own 50%, which of course we don't now. They own always less than 5%, say 2% in the US, 4% in Europe. In the 19th century, it was between 1% and 2% for the bottom 50%. So, there's been a little improvement, but, it's still close to 0. Now, the top 10%, actually, their share has declined quite significantly. So if you look at European societies before World War I, the top 10% would own 80 to 90% of the total. So almost everything. Whereas today they would own 50 to 60% of the total, which is still a lot for 10% of the population, of course. But this is a very significant decline. So who has gained? Well, this is this sort of middle 40% who are not in the bottom 50 and who are not in the top 10. This group used to own very little, 5 to 10% of the total. So they were a bit richer than the bottom 50% by definition, but not so much richer. So in the sense, there was no real middle class, at that time. Whereas today, they would own 20, 30, or even sometimes 40% of the total, which, given that they are 40% of the population, this doesn't make them very rich. It means that on average, they typically own around average wealth. So, 100,000 euros, 200,000 euros, 300. So you're not very rich, when you own 100, 200, 300, but you're far from being completely poor. And by the way, you don't like to be treated like a poor person because you feel, you've owned something, you've accumulated something. And so in the long run, we have this improvement in the sense that the share of total wealth going to this middle 40% has increased. Now, the problem is that in recent decades, starting around 1980, 1990, this share has actually declined a little bit, especially in the US, where it used to be like in Europe, 30-35% of total wealth for this middle 40% group, and it's going toward 20-25%. It's still better than in the 19th century when it was 2 or 5 or 10%, but it's not going in the right direction. And in Europe, the increase in inequality has been less strong than in the US, but still it's the positive trend has stopped. So to summarize, we've made progress, but we still have enormous inequality of wealth. In particular, the bottom 50% don't own anything. And one of the big questions I am asking in my research is, okay, what can we do in the future to improve access to wealth, access to property, in particular for the bottom 50%? So some people could say.
Let me ask about that, because so we have this mixed story, right, where we continue to have a lot of inequality, but the society is actually a lot more equal than it was, and it's important to you to emphasize that because you want to emphasize the scope for political agency, right? So tell us about how political agency has actually won those improvements. What it is, what political events and what laws and institutions have allowed us over the last centuries to make some significant progress towards equality, and then tell us a little bit about what that implies for what kind of future political action you think would be necessary to make sure that the march towards equality continues.
Yeah, exactly. So how what can we do to try to improve the how much the bottom 50% is getting, and what can we learn from the past progress that has been made? One story will be we just need to wait for growth and market competition to spread the wealth. If you look at the share going to the bottom 50%, the problem is that we've had growth for 2 centuries and we've not seen much improvement in the share going to the bottom 50%. So if we just wait for that, this might take a very long time. Another interpretation will be, okay, we cannot do better than that. If we try to redistribute wealth towards the bottom 50%, the sky is going to fall, the economy is going to stop working, because we actually need this level of concentration of wealth for the economy to operate. Now, that could be true, except that the historical evidence, coming to your question, is that, in fact, in the past, when we've had this big decline in the share going to the top 10% and this big increase, so this big redistribution towards the middle 40%, the economy did not stop working. In fact, if anything, this increased the growth rate of the economy. So why is it so? And how did it happen? And what can we learn for the future? Well, some people stress, and I have contributed to that, the role of World War I, World War II in the destruction of very top wealth holders. But in the end, this is not the most important part of the story, because if it was just this shock, we should have returned to the previous level more or less after that. So if we've had a structural change in the distribution, this is due to more sort of positive and constructive reasons, which have been, first of all, the generally speaking, the rise of the welfare state, the rise of free and public and relatively universal education, has not only contributed a lot to modern growth and modern productivity growth, but also has made the distribution of income and the distribution of labor income more equal. And this has also contributed to give the possibility for the middle class, to save and accumulate more wealth. The tax progressivity, the fact that the tax system has become more progressive during the 20th century, and so, ask more tax for people in the top 10%, top 1%, has also contributed to reduce taxation for the middle class, as compared to what you would have had in a system with a regressive tax system like the one we had in the 19th century. So, all these positive factors, have contributed, to reduce inequality in the long run, and also, I want to stress, to increase prosperity. The fact that in particular the US economy was, by far the most productive in the world, in the middle of the 20th century, was due to the fact that there was this very substantial educational advance of the US at the time. In 1950, 90% of the cohort would go to high school in the US. At the same time, it was 20–30% in Germany, in France, in Japan. And you need to wait until the 1980s, 90s to see a catch up both of education and productivity. And between the US and Western Europe and Japan. And in the middle of the 20th century, in fact, the US tax system is the most progressive in history. Top tax rate are 80–90%. And, if you take an average between 1930 and 1980, you have a top tax rate of 82%. This does not prevent growth, productivity growth, innovation, because, income gaps of 1 to 100, 1 to 200 are just not necessary for growth. And, I'm not saying you want full equality. Maybe you need income gap of, 1 to 5, 1 to 10, 1 to 20. People can disagree about that. I tend to, my reading of the historical evidence I have is that, 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 at most is absolutely sufficient. But in any case, 1 to 100, 1 to 200, these kinds of huge gaps, my reading of the evidence, and I've spent a lot of time collecting this data, comparing societies, is that it's just not necessary. In the recent decades, you've had this huge increase in billionaire wealth concentration at the top. This was supposed to boost the economy, to lead to a much faster rise of average income and average wages, in particular in the US. This is the promise that Ronald Reagan made in the 1980s. 30 years later, what we see is that the growth rate of national income per capita in the US has been divided by 2 between 1950, 1980, and 1990, 2020. And, I think this has contributed to huge disappointment in the US, and also to the fact that the Republican Party, has become a lot, anti-foreigners, anti-China, anti-Mexican, anti-Muslim, because in effect, they had to find some explanation as to why, the hard work of America, did not pay off in terms of income growth. And so I think in the end, this false promise, had a very negative impact. But to summarize, the reduction of inequality, and, in particular, the increase in the share of total wealth going to the middle class, came in the 20th century through a number of public policies. Broadly speaking, the rise of social security, free education, progressive taxation. And so the key question is, based on these historical lessons, how can we keep making progress in the future? And in particular, how can we improve, the share of total wealth owned by the bottom 50%, which, as I said, is still very, very, very small today.
So I want to come to some of the suggestions you have for how to do that. But before that, Fo, I would love to get you a sense of what the historical role of the left is going to be in that process. Because as I understand it, one of the strange ironies of the economic transformations of the last century, and perhaps particularly the last decade, is that it has changed the socioeconomic base of the left. The left always had a very large working class constituency, as well as a middle and upper middle class constituency consisting of intellectuals and teachers and state employees and so on. But because of the rapid growth of the middle and upper middle class, and because of a set of cultural transformations that have weakened the support for the left among the working class, that is, as you've chronicled, no longer what the left looks like today. In fact, the left in many countries has become so bourgeois that it tends to earn more money than the right on average, or at least than very many right-wing voters. So, is the left, if its social base has come to be upper middle class professionals in the suburbs of the United States who've gone to good colleges, for example, still going to be able to be a motor for that kind of equality? Will the right, ironically, become a motor for that kind of equality if some of the sort of populist Republicans, for example, actually manage to build a working class cross-racial coalition? Or is there simply going to be no historical motive for that kind of equality, which might perhaps be a reason to be more fatalistic about the developments of the next decades than you've been in your recent book?
Yes, so we have, I talk about this in Capital and Ideology, and we also have a recent collective book with Amaury Guettin and Clara Martinez Tolenado, where we study, the transformation of the structure of social inequality and political cleavages in 50 electoral democracies from 1948 to 2020, basically all Western countries, but also lots of non-Western countries, which have seen interesting evolution as well. But just to summarize the findings for Western democracies, what we've seen, in recent decades is the rise of what I have proposed to call the Brahmin left, by which I mean the high educated left. What's striking is that what you have today is a sort of division. Both the upper class and the lower class are divided, to summarize. So, if you look at the upper class, the high education elite now tend to vote for the left, but the high wealth elite, still voting for the right. So, you have a division between the two. Now, if you have both high education and high wealth, sometimes you are a bit lost between those two different allegiances. But, if you separate the two effects, because, not everybody has both, you can see very clearly the two different effects, which was not the case, if you look at the 1950-1980 period, the sort of classical period for the left, they will get both the low wealth and low education and low income. So all these different dimensions of socio-economic stratification were sort of aligned. Whereas today you have sort of a misalignment between this, in particular, education and property and wealth and the one. You also have, if you look now at the bottom of society, a huge division, because it will be too simple to say, working class has moved to the right. Well, it depends which working class. You have different forms of the working class, and as if you look at the minorities, which in fact are the majority of working class in the US today, and will be more and more the majority of working class in the future, the Republican Party is not doing particularly well. And if you look,
so that's rapidly changing when you look at the biggest minority group, which is Latinos, for example. So
what you mean? They start from 80% support, and now they only have 70% support for Democrats, 65. It's still
among Latinos, we're not very far away now from 50-50. I think we're at 60-40 in many states and in many polls.
60-40.
Fast forward 5 or 10 years, and that may not.
Well, 60-40 is a big difference from 50-50, and if you look at the African American, we've always been above 80-20, for the past 60 years, and I don't think this is going to change anytime soon. If you look in Europe, well, I can tell you in France, in the recent elections, you take the poorest department in France, which is the Seine-Saint-Denis in the north suburbs of Paris, with lots of North African immigrants, and also, other people who are not North African or African immigrants, but who live with them and, don't have the kind of conflict that some people, in rural areas have with non-European immigration. People did not vote at all for the populist right. They actually voted for the left with huge electoral score for the left bloc, 50, 60%, 70% of the vote sometime, in Seine-Saint-Denis or in the poorest area of Marseille. Now, if you look at the rural poor, the white rural poor, then indeed they vote for the populist right. So what I'm saying is that both in the US and in Europe, when you look at working class vote, we have to be very careful because we have a division between. So, which is also, you have also a division in the upper class vote, as I was explaining, for different reasons, although they are partly related, but these are by and large different reasons. So this is the big picture, is that we used to have an electorate that is very much divided among sort of one-dimensional class lines, and today we have an electorate that is divided among more multi-dimensional social class division, if you wish. Now,
let me push you towards, I think, what the core of the question was, which is when you look at a party like the Democrats today, who certainly do have very strong support among African Americans, who have strong but much less univocal support among non-white voter groups like Hispanics, but who also, in their leading exponents, in their strategists, in their staff, in the media outlets which determine much of their language, much of their program, are very dominated by an upper and upper middle class, highly educated elite.
No, you're right. You're right. So
what are the prospects for the Democratic Party or for left-wing parties in Europe to be the motors of this kind of historical change towards equality?
Yeah. So to summarize, I think the problem is that the left has sort of given up on ambitious redistributive program, and indeed has been sort of taken over to a large extent by a sort of high education university graduate agenda. And I think this is due to a more general ideological transformation that happened during the 1980s, 1990s. So I think the fall of communism and Soviet Union, was a very good news for people living under the communist bloc. But this has had, lot sorts of consequences. I mean, one of which is the rise of nationalism in Russia that we see the effect of today. So, it was sort of a miracle that the end of the Soviet Union sort of happened almost peacefully, except in ex-Yugoslavia, but in the Soviet Union itself, almost peacefully. 30 years later, we can see that, it's, the consequences in terms of end of sort of universalist objective and rise of nationalism, is still very much with us today. And in the West, this has contributed during the 1990s and early 2000 to the rise of a sort of unlimited faith in the self-regulated power of the market, and the fact that market competition, globalization, is going to solve every problem, and we can stop thinking about redistribution, regulation. This has started to change. I think after the 2008 financial crisis, people have realized the limits of deregulation and market competition, and I think the pandemic is also going to contribute and has already contributed to the end of neoliberalism. The big question today is, is this going to be replaced by neo-nationalism, partly for the reason I indicated, both in the US, in Russia, in Europe, in India, in Brazil, or are we going to have, the beginning of sort of a new agenda for equality redistribution? I talk about participatory socialism. Some people don't want to use the word socialism. Okay, use another word if you want. But in any case, we need to rebuild a sort of, egalitarian universalist platform. And I think, if the left does not go in this direction, they will never be able to regain support from the working class. The good news. So let me just finish on this. Most of the working class voters, it's not that they are convinced, by the xenophobic right. Most of the working class voters actually stay at home. They just stopped voting. If you look at participation in electoral democracy, well, it's not a very good news, but at least what this shows is that, if they were enthusiastic about the populist right, they would all vote, go and vote for Le Pen and Trump, with 90% participation rate, like what we had actually in Western European democracies between 1950 and 1980. In the US, the poor never had very high participation rate anyway. But I think this is what it will take if you want to bring back to the voting booth, some of these voters. You have to go for, take the billionaire tax and wealth taxation. This is very popular in the US public opinion, not only among Democratic voters, but also among working class Republican voters. Now, if the Democratic elite, media elite, financial elite, educated elite, keeps opposing this kind of evolution, of course, that's not going to help, because this contributes to portray, the left as a sort of elite left, upper educated left. So, this will take a major transformation of the economic platform in order to achieve this change.
So I know that you're not an American citizen, I believe, and you're not a campaign strategist, but let's imagine, and perhaps this has happened, that Ron Klein, the White House Chief of Staff, rings you up tomorrow and says, we're struggling in the polls, and there's a real chance that Donald Trump comes back in 2024, and that would be a major threat to our democracy. We want to change, and tell us how we can change in such a way that we will actually help to combat some of the problems, that we will actually make a real move towards equality, and that we mobilize all of those people who are staying home, but we actually appeal to them. What changes do you think they would need to make culturally to make sure that the Democratic Party ceases to be seen as the party of educated elites? And what changes do they need to make in the economic program to appeal to some of the working class voters who are either staying at home today or tempted to vote for the Republican Party?
So this is a question about the US, right? Because, let me make clear that, I'm not particularly hopeful about the US. I think the US political system is so corrupt by money, by the private finance, that I think this can change, but, I'm more hopeful in Europe or other parts of the world than in the US. But,
I want to hear an answer about the US, but feel free to also answer about Europe.
I'm happy to answer about the US, but, sometimes people in the US also, there's a risk that they are only interested in the US, which I think is a big problem. But I think it's 5% of the world population, and the other 95% are at least as interested. But going back to the US, I think the Democratic Party, had a chance to attract younger voters and more working class voters, with the kind of platforms that Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren were pushing. And I think the Democratic Party has to talk about those who suffer from huge debt, student debt, or mortgage debt. What do you do with people who have a big debt?
But let me sorry to interrupt you, but let me jump in on student debt, because look, I think that the European system of organizing universities where students don't have to go into student debt is much superior to the American one, right? But when I look at the program of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and something like student debt, it actually isn't a promise to transform the system. It's a promise to forgive the debt of people who on average have gone to law school and medical school and stand to make a lot of money in their life. So it actually redistributes money from the poor to the rich. So isn't that part of the problem rather than part of the solution?
Yeah, I mean, if you don't let me finish what I start, it's going to be difficult. So I was talking about, debt in general. So again, if you look at the bottom 50% of the population in the US, who are not people who are going to be doctors or lawyers or whatever, let me be very clear. These are people who have enormous debt, some of them for their studies, some of them because they wanted to buy a home and they are struggling to repay their mortgage, or because they tried to create a firm, it was not as successful as they would have liked it to be, and they end up sometime, with a debt which is much bigger than their assets. So, this is redistribution of wealth towards this group of people. This takes, different form. Debt cancellation can be interesting, but I certainly agree that we need to look exactly at the conditions, and you certainly don't want to have debt cancellation for people who are about to earn millions. We agree on that. So I think it's very important, to put a condition, and generally speaking, to use progressive tax schedule based on income, but also based on wealth, because you cannot define, tax justice and social justice in general just by looking at income. It's very important to look at wealth. There are other ways to redistribute wealth that are more structural, that have to do with a minimum inheritance for all. I have proposed to have, everybody at age 25 receiving, 120,000 euros in the European context, or, it could be the equivalent in dollars, or $150,000, which, I think will create a much more dynamic economy. I think, the many poor people in the US, if you look at the bottom 50%, bottom 60, or even 70% in the US economy, they don't believe that the economy is fair. They don't believe that, people at the top own everything because they are so productive, and the bottom people are just, lazy, unproductive people who deserve what they have. I think people realize, who's working hard. You have people working incredibly hard, in the gig economy, in traditional blue-collar jobs, in the service sector, in shops, in all sorts of health sector jobs with terrible working conditions. And if you had, a platform to redistribute income and wealth and, working condition, in a very ambitious manner in the direction of this group, I think this is simply the only way to try to bring back voters to the voting booths. Or it means that, people believe, give up on this would be to say, okay, these people will never vote, these people will never participate, which would be a sort of very, nihilistic view of democracy, which, by the way, will be very dangerous, not only for the US or for Europe, but for the world in general, because, you have alternative political and economic system today, including, of course, Chinese autocracy and Russian autocracy, who are promoting an alternative view of development, through investment in Africa, in South Asia, etc. And if Western countries, are not able to promote a model of economic development that's based on more equality within the West, but also at the international level, I think there's a very big risk that somehow, the winner of the competition will be autocratic development model, and so I think, it's the stakes are enormous, and we have to give up on the kind of completely wrong ideological claims about always more concentration of power and wealth in a few hands, which is a sort of I really want to stress this. I stress this in my work. You have this sort of sacralized view, or almost monarchical view of the economy, centered on a very small group of individuals, which I think, I can understand why people, many people are afraid of democratic deliberation about the proper distribution of wealth. And they say, oh, if we start having this democratic deliberation about wealth redistribution, where are we going to stop? That's too complicated. So, let's sacralize the winner. Let's not touch at all. I can see where it comes from. But at the end of the day, first, this is nihilistic, because with this kind of nihilistic view of democracy, this is what's going to give the floor to autocracy. And two, secondly, this is not based on a proper assessment of history. Because if you look at the lessons from the 20th century, well, I think very progressive taxation was a huge success. Huge educational expansion and social, security expansion was a huge success. So, these are the new steps that we need to look at today, both for education, health, infrastructure, and the redistribution of wealth itself.
If 50 or 100 years from now, somebody writes a follow-up to a brief history of equality and says, things have gone as well as we possibly could have imagined. The march towards equality has continued, and perhaps it's even accelerated. what would that author's description of the present look like? Which is to say, if we succeed in pushing towards more equality, what will our societies be like in 50 or 100 years?
Well, I think, it will be a society with a much more, inclusive distribution of power in general. So, we've talked a lot about wealth in our discussion, but let me stress that what matters the most is not so much money in itself, but really the power and opportunities that come with it. When you have no wealth at all, your bargaining power vis-a-vis society in general and vis-a-vis your own life is very small, because if you own zero or if you only have debt, you have to accept everything. You have to accept any job, any working condition, any wage you are being proposed, because you need to pay your rent, you need to feed your family. If you own just 100, 200, 300,000 euros or dollars, this seems very small to people who have millions or billions, but in fact it makes a huge difference as compared to a zero, because it means you don't need to accept everything right away. You can sort of think about it. You have other options. You can start a company, you can buy a home, so that you can start projects in life which does not require you to pay your rent every month. So this changes the distribution of power in society. Now there are other ways to change the distribution of power in societies. This includes participation to the electoral process, financing of political parties, financing of the media in a much more egalitarian manner. And there are proposals that have been made about democratic equality vouchers, media vouchers, so that we have a much more egalitarian distribution of power with respect to political influence. This also involves, more democracy on the workplace. And I want to stress this because we didn't have time to talk about this, but I think one of the very successful transformations of the 20th century was, more workers' rights. In particular, there are countries, like Germany, Sweden, Nordic European countries, where workers have up to 50% of voting rights in the board of corporations, which, okay, it's always 50% plus one for shareholders, but it means that if in addition to this 50% of voting rights as workers also have a 10% stake in the capital of the company, or if a local government has a 10% stake in the capital of the company, then the majority can shift to workers, even in front of a shareholder who has 90% of the stock of the company. And I can tell you that from the point of view of a shareholder, in France or in the US, in UK, where you don't have this kind of legislation, this looks like communism, except that this has been in place in Germany and Sweden, since the 1950s. And I think by and large, this has been very successful. I think this has allowed, workers to be involved in the long-term strategy of companies. And, in the end, this has been very successful. I think in the societies that I imagine in 50 years, 60 years, 80 years, we should build on that and go even further. So what I propose, what I describe in my book is, okay, you should have at least 50% of voting rights for worker representative in all companies, small and large. And in the other 50% of voting rights going to shareholders, you could have a cap on the maximum share of voting rights going to a single shareholder, maybe who should not have more than 10% of these 50% of voting rights in companies of more than 100 workers, whatever. I mean, you can, we're not going to decide, you and me today, about the perfect formula, but you see the general idea is that, you cannot have, one single individual cannot have so much power. It's not the fact that you had good ideas at the age of 25 or 30, or that you were very lucky, or both, should not imply that you keep all the decision-making power at the age of 50, at the age of 80, at the age of 90, especially with the very long life expectancy that we have today. So you need to sort of rebalance and redistribute power permanently in society through the tax system and redistribution of wealth, but also through the legal system of how companies and economic units are being governed. So, this is a kind of circulation of power that I imagine in the future. And I think, if someone today were to look at the workers' rights or tenants' rights in 1910, where, a property owner, because you own a building or because you own a company, you can fire your workers or your tenants, or you can double their rent or divide their wage by 2 the next morning, when we look at that today, we say, oh, okay, this was really very extreme. And today, there are rules you can, and I'm looking at the transformation of these rules in the long run, and if I'm trying to imagine the next step, this will look like what I've just described, but of course, the real course followed by history, is always different from what we can plan rationally. So I'm just trying to give some hints as about possible trajectories, but big crises, in particular the environmental crisis to come, which we didn't have time to talk much about, will invent its own solution. And I think, together with the competition with China and autocracies, the environmental crisis to come can change attitudes toward inequality and attitudes towards the economic system very fast, because when people see the concrete consequences on their life much more strongly than what they can see today, I think attitudes toward people who do space tourism and who take their private jet all day long and want to give lessons to the rest of the planet about how to solve their problem, I think people will not find this very funny for very long. So there are many forces of transformations that are difficult to forecast, but which I think, just like in the past, can transform power relation and in the end institutions much faster than what we typically imagine, and what the elites in every society always of course say, that nothing is ever going to change and nothing can ever change, except that things always change, and it will be the same in the future as it was in the past. And I think the lessons from economic and political histories that I'm trying to draw in my work can maybe contribute to the kind of democratization of economic knowledge that we need in order to prepare this possible change. But it will take major social and political fight, obviously.
Thomas Piketty, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.